Okay, thank you everybody for attending today's session. It's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Mike Holter. Mike Holter got his bachelor's at Carleton College, and then he went and did his PhD in neuroscience from Arizona State University, which is where I had met him. He was really interested in investigating the roles of ERK1/2 and GABAergic interneurons. He then went and did his postdoc at University of Michigan. And I think Mike's going to tell you a little bit about his journey through his career and how he got to his current position. But I think one of the things that he will highlight is that life kind of got in the way. And so after he did a quick postdoc stint, he went and got this scientific writing job, where he is now the associate director at Novartis, an Iniso company. So today he's going to talk to you about the science of storytelling. So Mike, please take it away.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Katie. So, I'll tell you about the science of storytelling, and I did add a little subtitle here, an investigation of the three pillars of medical communications. Um, I'll talk a little bit about what those three pillars are later, but in the current time, it's important to understand that these medical communications has a variety of different avenues that you could possibly go. And I've had the opportunity to kind of work across all three of these pillars. So I'll tell you a little bit about my experience there. So for the agenda, I'll first talk about my journey, taking that leap from academia into industry, and then I'll go into scientific storytelling and the three pillars of medical communications. And ultimately, I'll finish with a case study that I created on how to use effective language in each pillar. And so with that, let's start with my journey. So from my childhood into my career, my journey to science. So, like most of us, I started off as a little kid. And that little kid had some sort of vision in order to kind of move forward into my career. And it's really at about this age that my parents actually gave me my first toy microscope. And I was really interested in things like pond water, like how are these tiny little cells and organisms moving around something so small. I was really interested in kind of like that unseen world. But as things go when you're a little kid, I transitioned into something that was probably not possible. Really wanted to be a dinosaur by the time I was age 5. It was devastated to learn that this really wasn't possible. So ultimately, I settled on becoming a paleontologist or an archaeologist, in order to be able to study dinosaurs and not necessarily be one. And then from there, I went to something a little bit more tangible. I wanted to be a baseball player. So throughout my kind of like early high school and into my early college days, I was a pitcher. I know it's probably hard to see from this picture, but I wore number 4. And the reason for that was actually something that some of you will probably connect with. And number 4 was Lou Gehrig, who was a famous baseball player for the New York Yankees. It's kind of like my personal homage to him, and his story, battling ALS, and that kind of like fueled my career and my interest in neuroscience. And so from there, I went into graduate school. I was really interested in cellular mechanisms of neurological disorders, particularly developmental neurological disorders. Katie alluded to the fact that I was really interested in ERK1/2. Here, these are parvalbumin neurons in the hippocampus that have been affected by actually a hyperactive MEC1 gene. And I was really interested in just trying to figure out like how does cell signaling affect these different types of neurons, whether it be their identity or how they contribute to disease. I had a love-hate relationship with academia. So, kind of following my trajectory here through the years, you can see that I kind of had like a tumultuous experience in trying to figure out what it actually was that I wanted out of my career. And, from like my early graduate school years, I was really interested in staying in academics. It's my peak of my graduate school career. I was interested in the basic mechanisms of brain development. I really wanted to pursue that and kind of see how far I could go. Possibly to as an investigator at an R1 institution. Running my own lab, and really following these key questions that I was really interested in from that early time in my grad school career. But then, as you can see, I kind of transitioned into possibly wanting to go to industry. One thing that I got really interested in was the Allen Institute, which is up in Seattle. Um, and, I could possibly see myself at that time having transitioned over into kind of like a more a bench science role and kind of like that intersection between academia and industry. But ultimately, what I learned as I was kind of going through my career is that bench science was not really my path. Um, I really liked bench science and understanding how this worked, but ultimately, I just didn't think that I wanted to do molecular work. I didn't want to be sitting at a microscope anymore, and wanted to do something a little bit different. But then you can see I had that resurgence in my interest in academics. So I accepted my first postdoc at the University of Michigan, and ultimately just that kind of fueled my interest of going back into academics and maybe thinking that this is my career path that I want to stay with. But then COVID-19 happened, and that kind of really changed my perspective on what I wanted both out of my life and out of my career. And Katie alluded to part of my choice was actually going back to Arizona to be with my now wife. And I needed something that was going to give me the opportunity to be able to do that. And I ultimately settled on a commitment to clinical science and industry. So I'll talk to you a little bit about, how that journey went as well. But first, I had to figure out what it was that I really valued the most out of my career. Was it something like intellectual freedom and autonomy that you could get from academics? Is that choice that, to pursue the scientific questions and how you address them in choosing, what you want to do specifically within that academic realm? Kind of following out of that is that long-term research. You have in academics the ability to build a long-term career around a centralized idea. So did I want to be that investigator that submits and gets the same R01 for 5 cycles in a row? I thought that would be a really possibly really cool way to kind of build my career over 25, 30 years. Was it the academic culture that I valued? Was it the university environment in the sense of tradition? Did I want to follow in the footsteps of my academic advisors and become the next principal investigator that was following up on questions that I had found so valuable in graduate school and in my postdoc? Was it mentorship and teaching, contributing to the community by lifting up the next generation of young scientists? This is ultimately why I went to grad school, is that I wanted to teach, and I wanted to be, I wanted to be the professor that was standing up in front of 300 people and talking about developmental biology, for instance. Ultimately, what I settled on, and this is something that my advisors in my past did really well, was scientific storytelling. Ultimately, what I valued the most was crafting a compelling narrative for why science and medicine is important. And in today's climate, this is really kind of like a key facet of why we're doing what we do, is being able to tell people about the medicine and things that are coming that are going to help people in the future. And I had to ask myself a couple of really difficult questions as I was kind of considering my transition to medical writing. So medical writing being that like kind of key intersection of being able to tell a compelling story. The first was, am I ready to shift from independent research to a faster paced, deadline-driven environment? And one that was really difficult for me is the second question is, am I ready to possibly give up my years of experience in neuroscience for a new therapeutic area? Neuroscience is classically a difficult area for pharmaceutical companies to get into because drugs fail a lot. It can cost a lot of money to run these trials. And ultimately, it's just kind of difficult to be in that space. And then ultimately, what kind of impact do I hope to make on the medical field, and how might a medical writer role help me achieve that goal? We all develop key skills during our academic careers that translate to medical communications. So there are 2 different types of skills that people look at when transitioning from academics into like medical communications. You have your soft skills like critical thinking and problem solving, project management, relationship building, and adaptability, all that are critically important for when you're choosing to make that jump into the medical communication space. But then you also have technical skills like scientific writing and communication, data analysis and interpretation, literature review and synthesis, and the ability to deliver a clear presentation. And my apologies, I've been dealing with a little bit of a cold, but what people look for in the medical communication space is your transferability into a medical writing role. And I think one thing that was really difficult for me was that people weren't interested in the fact that I was really good at confocal microscopy anymore. These were the things that they cared about when I was making that transition. And so I had to play up these different types of skills in order to get there. For a simplified view of searching for and obtaining a medical writer role, the real key to finding a role in this space is LinkedIn. Every major pharmaceutical company and medical communications agency leverages LinkedIn to identify candidates that are poised to impact their businesses. And I work in a medical agency. I'll talk a little bit about what that is in a future slide. But in addition to kind of like working in that medical communications agency solar system, there are parallel systems that are in place specifically to find medical writers for these roles. And understanding how to find them as well is critically important. So what you do from there is that you would create and implement key search terms to find the right roles. For example, these are relatively basic, but you could look for like a medical writer, medical communications. You could look among the three pillars: publications, medical affairs, commercial, and marketing. And there's even regulatory medical writers as well, which I can talk about possibly in the later session, because that won't be a focus of what I'm talking about now. And then after you find those roles, then you optimize your resume to fit the job description. Then you network and open discussions with current employees and recruiters to ultimately generate your application.
Mike, I have a question.
Yeah.
If you go back to the last slide, LinkedIn is basically just like your personal web page, basically out to the public to like advertise yourself, whereas your resume is very tailored to the specific job application. So what are the key things or like differences you would look for on a LinkedIn profile versus a resume? Because you kind of can't tailor your LinkedIn profile too specific.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. So what people are looking for because they will look at both. They look at your LinkedIn page as well as your resume. And what they're looking for is consistency. So if I'm going to like develop a LinkedIn profile on my let's just say like I'm going to tell my story the way that I just mentioned it. I was interested in Lou Gehrig. I wanted to do, science and understand basic mechanisms of biology, and ultimately that fueled my interest in medical communications. They would look for, so they would look for how you promote yourself. But then on my LinkedIn profile as well, I have other things that match up to my resume. So for instance, right now I have almost 4 years of experience in the medical communications agency space. They'll be looking for whether or not that matches in my resume. Do I actually have 4 years of experience in the space? When I put skills into my LinkedIn profile, does that match with what's in my resume? And then ultimately with the resume optimization, I will say something like, I've created multiple publications for high impact clinical journals in the medical agency space or something like that. And, that might be something that's in the job description within that LinkedIn, promoted role.
One last follow-up question.
Yeah.
How, I guess, how do you say it? How active, if I'm looking for a job, how active would I need to be on LinkedIn and say like posting posts or like liking things, or can I just have my profile visible? Does it help or
Um,
hurt in any way?
Yeah, so posting definitely helps as long as it's something that is, you definitely want to be neutral and possibly share, people that share like cool things are the people that are getting specific roles. You don't want to just craft a post that doesn't really go anywhere. But if you're sharing something that's interesting about science that's possibly going to impact people, that's definitely helpful. Because these recruiters, they like to see how you engage with the scientific community, because that is a big part of this job, is, being able to engage with other people that are in any sort of space. So it could be engaging with patients and caregivers. It could be engaging with healthcare professionals. It could be engaging with academic researchers. Everybody has a role to play in kind of this like medical writing sphere. And yeah, so it's very important to kind of like be actively engaging. Though that said, if you do look at it's become more important in the recent times. If you look at my LinkedIn history, I've actually never made a post. I've really gone for kind of like those one-to-one interactions with recruiters and things like that, and that's worked out for me as well.
Hi, Mike. This is Barak. I have a question also.
Yeah.
How important it is to have a social media presence? Is it important to keep your social media also regarding or related to your scientific interests, or people do not care about your social media posts?
People don't really care that much about social media. It's really like LinkedIn and possibly a little bit of Twitter if you're doing something that is relevant to the space. But overall, they won't go and look for like other social media avenues like Facebook or Instagram or anything like that. It's really just a focus on the things that reach, the scientific community, which is, primarily LinkedIn and Twitter. But LinkedIn is definitely kind of that major social media-ish site that they're going to be tracking your history through. Any other questions?
Nope.
Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward then, and I'm going to use an example of my specific agency. So medical communications agencies often operate like a small solar system. So I'm currently working for Anesio Medical, which is our parent organization. Anesio Medical is one of 5 branches of the greater Anesio superfamily that works within this kind of like medical space. So under Anesio Medical, which is responsible for all of our business operations, client relations, and things like that, we have 3 major agencies called Nucleus Global, which is where I work, Apothecom and Metastrava, who are pretty similar to us. Metastrava has a little bit more of a technology focus than the other 2 agencies that are in here. But ultimately, we are medical communications agencies that offer specialized services to pharmaceutical clients that are pursuing bringing a drug to market. And in that light, we have other subgroups that kind of act like either small planets or like our moons in a way, that offer even further specialized services like editorial services. These are experts in in writing in general. So they are perfect when it comes to grammar in English, as well as like styles such as like AMA and APA, and they help us craft our scientific content so that when it gets put out into the public sphere, it's as perfect as it can possibly be. We have groups like CTO groups that do clinical trial optimization. They help clients find the right patients. They help clients find the right patients for their clinical trials. They might work with them on inclusion and exclusion criteria for clinical trials and things like that. And then we have studio teams as well. And these studio teams are essentially professional medical illustrators that, quite honestly, could put textbook figures to shame. So these people are extremely good with biological artwork, and they help us to create some really amazing imagery and videos for drug mechanisms of action and other disease state education types of things. So I kind of alluded to this a little bit, but the functions of a medical communication agency, we are really a specialized organization that supports pharmaceutical, biotech, and healthcare companies through the production of scientifically accurate and strategically aligned content. And these are kind of like our major 6 roles. We work on medical writing, strategic planning, ultimately what is your strategy to get a drug to market? We work on medical education. I could go out and do disease state education on ALS if that's if that's the disease state that I'm assigned to. I could work on key opinion leader engagement, sit with key opinion leaders and figure out what it is that they need in order to understand how a drug works, or what education the healthcare system needs in order to be able to use a drug effectively. We do internal training as well, which is imagine that you're bringing on a new individual into your company. We can work to onboard them with disease state education, as well as drug MOA education as well. And then we do data visualization. As I mentioned, there's a lot of different ways that we can do that. I create a lot of my own figures and a lot of my own visualizations, but we also have those masterful biological artists that can help us with visualization as well. And then each aspect of this strategy allows us to weave a scientific narrative for client assets in a given therapeutic area. So to kind of step back a little bit, my career trajectory through Nucleus Global has been relatively straightforward. So from my postdoc, I went into medical writer 2, and as you can see here, one of my rhetorical question fears kind of came true. I did have to leave neuroscience in order to come into this role. And I started in one of the pillars, publications, which we'll talk about again a little bit later, in oncology. And for me, this transition actually was relatively simple, given that the complex that I ended up working on as a medical writer 2 was actually exactly what I was doing as a postdoc, just now in cancer instead of in neuroscience. From there, I was promoted to a senior medical writer, and I made a shift in kind of the language trajectory that I was working on. So I was put into a different pillar in commercial marketing, still in oncology, now working on a different drug. From there, I was promoted to lead medical writer in medical affairs. Again, another shift in the type of language that I'd be using, and I got brought back into psychiatry. So it ended up coming full circle. Though it's not a developmental disorder that I was particularly interested in during my grad school days, I was back doing something in the brain that I found particularly impactful for this patient population. And now where I'm currently at as an associate scientific director in medical affairs, I'm still with this same account, working in psychiatry. So what do my current responsibilities look like as an associate scientific director? So I lead the scientific content development for a wing of this account. So, my responsibility here is to lead the creation and ultimately perform the quality control of scientific deliverables. So publications is not something that I really handle anymore as an associate scientific director, but it is something that I could do. One thing that I put on here as well is an advisory board, which is imagine sticking 10 of your most impactful key opinion leaders in a room and asking them a bunch of questions about how you might bring a drug to market, and what types of data that you need. I develop all of the content for that, and we, develop meeting reports following those, and I, kind of lead that group of a small group of writers to develop all of that content. I do a lot of scientific strategy, so I develop specific strategic messaging in accordance with client objectives. So one of these types of deliverables is a messaging framework. So these are typically called scientific platforms, which will give the pharma company the language that they need in order to go out into the field and discuss their drug in the public. I manage client relations. I act as a scientific point of contact and therapeutic area expert for clients in alignment with their brand goals. So as you can probably imagine, through my career so far here, I've already been on a few different accounts and have had to get up to speed with different therapeutic areas relatively quickly. And so I'm kind of like, am I really an expert in this space? Not quite, in comparison to, say, like a doctor that's been working on this for 30 years. But I do have to know all of the literature. I have to know where to find all of the specific information that a client might need. And I have to be up to speed with, the current literature that's coming in order to help them progress in their own careers. Team mentorship. So I mentor junior medical writers and review their work for accuracy, clarity, and scientific integrity. So currently I have 2 medical writers that work alongside me in 2 different therapeutic areas, actually. So we work on a variety of different questions together, and ultimately still doing the same thing of trying to ladder up to that scientific strategy and develop strong scientific content that's going to be impactful for our clients. I do a lot of competitive intelligence, so I have to stay up to date on developments and emerging trends in my assigned therapeutic area. This involves a lot of work at congresses and things like that. So I will go to congresses and specifically hang out at other booths of competitor companies and try to figure out what it is that they're talking about, understand what type of content they're putting out into the space, and bring that back and ultimately use that to inform our own scientific strategy. And then lastly, I do a lot of business development. So we, as associate scientific directors, there's more than just one of me within the company in this role. We contribute to pitch decks, proposals, and brainstorming of new business opportunities. Because at the end of the day, a medical communications agency, one thing that you have to do to survive is develop new business. You need to be able to get more money in order to support, our own life, right? So that's kind of a key component of what we do.
Mike,
Okay.
I've got a question. If you can go back to your last slide, this is all great. I was just curious if you could talk about because you went up through the ranks, what a typical day would be like for a medical writer 1 or 2 who had just gotten into this field.
Yeah. So for a medical writer 1 or medical writer 2, your day-to-day is a lot of content development. So it's going to be spending time in the literature, actually doing the groundwork of writing a publication, of creating a Congress abstract or a poster, working with the different one like your pharmaceutical client, but then also possibly like doctors or other healthcare professionals in the space in order to kind of craft the messaging for that specific project. So you'll kind of like own a siloed piece of a project that or of an account and develop that from start to finish. The senior medical writer kind of does the same thing, but in addition to that, the senior medical writer might also mentor a younger or like newer medical writer in the space. But still, like you're given a little bit more autonomy, where as with like an entry-level medical writer, we might be a little bit more on top of like how things are being run. A senior medical writer is given a little bit more autonomy there and kind of expected to be able to do like high quality work immediately with minimal input, but still working on like a specific project. A lead medical writer starts to diverge into a little bit more of business development and starting to like run multiple projects that get tasked out to medical writers and senior medical writers. The lead medical writer still does a lot of their own content development on a day-to-day basis. They're also responsible possibly for reviewing content that comes from entry-level medical writers and senior medical writers. So, and then as an associate scientific director, where I'm at now, about half of my day is spent one in meetings for a variety of different purposes. That might be for working with a client in order to develop pieces of strategy, but then the other half is making sure that a medical writer, a senior medical writer, a lead medical writer has the support that they need in order to complete the work that they're asked, that's asked of them. And in addition to that, I'm responsible in some ways for creating my own content. So I will create my own slides and slide decks, but then also I will be reviewing all of the content that comes back from the entry level positions and up to the lead medical writer. Other questions? And I'm happy to go into more detail on this in the session after this as well.
Yeah, why don't you keep going?
Okay. So I'm going to step back through this slide that you've seen and move into the scientific storytelling in the 3 pillars of medical communications. So the origins of the scientific narrative in the pharmaceutical space really encompasses kind of 3 major steps. You have data generation, which is what we're all familiar with. That could be preclinical modeling, dose finding and toxicity studies, running clinical trial studies, and real world evidence generation. That funnels into functional integration. So then you would involve these three different pillars: publications, medical affairs, and commercial marketing teams, ultimately to weave a cohesive medical communications plan together. And then with those three pillars coming together, you create a unified medical narrative that is essentially the development of a scientifically accurate, clinically relevant, and strategic messaging platform that drives a pharmaceutical or a novel agent toward market. So the three pillars of medical communications, as I alluded to, are publications, medical affairs, and commercial marketing. So publications is responsible for the development and dissemination of scientific and clinical data through peer-reviewed journals, Congress abstracts, posters, and presentations. And I know that some of you on this call have clinical experience. Congress abstracts and posters also serve as like a mini type of manuscript. This is finalized data that goes out from a pharmaceutical company to a Congress, and that ultimately is an important path for the dissemination of their own clinical trial data, in addition to kind of the manuscripts that we're used to writing for our own work in academics. Medical affairs serves as the bridge between clinical development and commercialization through field-based medical education and engagement. So this is the team that goes out into the public sphere and tries to figure out, what the space needs what the space needs to understand about a new drug MOA, or what education they need on a specific disease state to understand what the pharmaceutical company is trying to do. It's important to note that a medical affairs team doesn't actually really use the name of the drug. They go out specifically for educational purposes. And then commercial marketing is to develop strategy to promote a product by increasing brand awareness and driving adoption in the market. So this is kind of like a later stage component of, now we have a drug that's in phase 3, and we're now looking to figure out how that drug is going to be positioned in the market should the trial data be positive.
Quick question. If I were to look for a medical writing job, would it be really obvious which of these three pillars that position is siloed into?
So yes and no. It depends on what company that you're looking at in the agency space. Some of them are looking for like a general medical writer, and then ultimately you could go either of these three ways. Though I would say most of the time, for an entry-level medical writer position, they will specify publications. And part of that is that we know publications from our academic background, right? So this is what we've been working towards for our entire academic careers. This is where our skills are the most transferable, at least right away. So a lot of them will specify publications almost immediately. And the further that you go up the chain, it becomes a little bit more transparent. So for me now as an associate director, they will tell me like, this is in medical affairs or this is in commercial marketing. But for a medical writer, it's usually either publications or not specified. Okay. So each of these pillars functions independently to contribute to the story of a product. And so what you might think is that each of these pillars works kind of in tandem and works holding hands together in order to kind of create that medical narrative, but that's actually not the case. They're kind of siloed off from each other. So for instance, the publications team cannot promote products or tailor messaging in their publications to market strategy. So it's kind of like a big thing about pre-approval promotion that the publications team just cannot touch. But then also they can receive limited to no input from like a medical affairs team or a commercial marketing team on the manuscript content and the choice of a journal. All of that is up to the publications team and in conjunction with the clinical investigators on the trial. In medical affairs, the teams must maintain a non-promotional tone. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, their whole goal is disease state education and drug mechanism of action. So the field team itself is also separated from the sales teams. They're not permitted to share any promotional content. So it's important that they stay away from that and really just kind of stick to that disease state education and MOA space. Commercial marketing teams cannot direct the messaging of publications or any of the medical education initiatives that a medical affairs team will produce. They may only use pre-approved promotional materials, and they cannot influence off-label drug use. Big issue in the space as well is that a lot of investigators will want to use drugs off-label. So, for example, let's take a drug on cognition, for instance. Cognition is a symptom, or like cognitive impairment is a symptom across a wide variety of different disorders. But if it's approved in, say, Alzheimer's disease, you can't necessarily use it in a different disease that it's not approved for. So you can't influence off-label drug use like that in commercial marketing. And so there's a firewall that pharmaceutical companies employ called the medical, legal, and regulatory review process that ultimately ensures that all of these boundaries are kept. So even working in the medical agency space, a publications team that we set up in our agency will never talk to the medical affairs team, and they will never talk to the commercial team. They're completely siloed from each other, and you're working on this kind of like one facet at a given time. So as in another answer to Katie's question, you really have to think about which of these pillars you want to go to if you were to come over to the medical communications agency space, because you will have to stay there at least for a little bit. Each pillar crafts its own materials independently to contribute to a product story. So publications teams, generally speaking, create Congress abstracts, posters, clinical trial manuscripts, literature synthesis for internal use. So think like essentially doing a journal club in an email format. And then they also develop data-driven symposia. So these would be the talks that you would see at congresses that are presenting clinical trial results, for instance. Medical affairs teams, generally speaking, will create a lot of slide decks. So MSL, in this case, is medical science liaison. We develop a lot of disease state, pipeline, and unmet need content. We do KOL engagements and summaries from those. Disease state symposia, Congress booth materials, advisory boards, which I mentioned previously is a really key component for a pharmaceutical company. We also develop scientific platforms that unite all of the language across the different teams. And then commercial and marketing teams develop KOL engagement summaries. And I want to highlight that even though I have this in both medical affairs and commercial marketing teams, the goal is very different between these two. KOL engagement in a medical affairs team is going to be disease state oriented. What do you need to know about the disease? What do you need to know about the novel mechanism of action that we're trying to bring to market? Whereas the commercial marketing team is going to say, in a KOL engagement, how do you think that this drug is going to be positioned in the market comparison to like the standard of care? They also develop promotional materials, other slide decks like unmet needs, disease state, and kind of like a key focus of commercial marketing is the treatment landscape. And then they also do advisory boards, again, kind of on the positioning of drugs rather than on disease state education. Each pillar also has a different target audience. So for publications, your target audience is primarily key opinion leaders, academic researchers, clinical investigators, and regulatory and scientific bodies. In medical affairs, this has expanded quite a bit. So while we do still have some of the same target audience as you might have for publications, we also add care teams like other healthcare professionals such as NPs, APRNs, RNs, and PAs, people that see patients hands-on. What do they need to know about the disease in order to be able to treat patients more effectively? We'll work with other members of patient care teams, such as social workers, case managers, and caregivers. And then we also work with internal stakeholders, so the key leaders across both the publications and the commercial and marketing teams to understand what they need, and then regulatory bodies as well. And then commercial marketing has almost an entirely different audience from publications and medical affairs. Here, you're looking primarily for prescribing healthcare professionals, working with healthcare systems, understanding what they need in order to be able to bring a drug into their system, pharmacy decision makers, and then also in some cases, they will discuss with patients and caregivers. And it's really rare to be able to do that with patients and caregivers, but it's becoming kind of like a bigger facet of the broad pharmaceutical space to really engage with patients and understand what they need and what they want out of their treatment. So understanding your target audience is incredibly important for crafting a cohesive medical narrative. So from a patient and caregiver, medical literacy varies, and you need to think about creating content that has basic explanations of scientific concepts. So there is some literature out there that suggests that the average American can read at an 8th grade level, and we have to consider that when we're thinking of of patients and caregivers. And it's not always the case that, some patients will have greater insight into their disease than others. But, when we're thinking about content complexity, the patient and caregiver tends to be on kind of like the bottom rung there. Then that goes up to social workers and case managers. So social workers and case managers tend to have foundational medical or scientific knowledge. They're primarily familiar with medical terminology and treatment goals of a specific plan. So if you're working in the space of psychiatry, for instance, social worker is going to understand that is going to understand the treatment plan and try to help the patient with managing their own treatment plan, such as like how many times they have to take the drug per day, things like that. From there, you go up to healthcare professionals like NPs, APRNs, and PAs, and they have strong comprehension of medical science and clinical trial data, and they tend to be primarily interested in information that's going to directly impact patient day-to-day care. These are the people that see patients on a daily basis, and they want things that are going to help them in their kind of like day-to-day work life that is going to impact how they treat the patient. And then from there, you go up to KOLs. For an example, that could be somebody like a psychiatrist that have a command of the therapeutic area, scientific and regulatory guidelines, drug mechanisms of action, and how trial results fit the current standards. So a KOL, these are, like I said here, these are the people that are kind of like at the top level. They want as complex content as possible, and they want to understand the disease state and drug MOAs to a higher level than what you would give for some of these other tiers. Okay, so now I'm going to take or kind of move into a different space and give you a case study of how each pillar uses language. And I want to preface this with this is a story that I created specifically for this presentation. So this company does not exist, and these drugs do not exist either. So for a case study, let's take the case of Seer Biopharma. Let's say that they're interested in multiple sclerosis, and this is their tagline. They're guided by insight, driven by science, transforming MS care with vision and purpose. Very commercial type of line that they're going to give you in their pursuit of bringing a new treatment to market for multiple sclerosis. So the background, this recent startup, Seer Biopharma, develops a drug called KR1994 to combat symptoms of multiple sclerosis. They devised this head-to-head phase 3 clinical trial to evaluate KR1994 versus the current standard of care, MH1991, that has been on the market for several years. And in the space, you often won't see drug names. You'll see them listed as their kind of molecule names until they are approved. And following that clinical trial readout, each communication pillar of Seer disseminated their own information about the results of the trial. So to give you a little bit more background here, let's say of these two imaginary molecules that they have different properties. Drug 1, MH1991, is a selective S1P1 inhibitor. It's a once daily oral pill, and adverse events that patients typically get from this are bradycardia, infection, macular edema, and it's been on the market for several years. Drug 2, KR1994, is a CD19 targeting monoclonal antibody. It is an injection that is given once every 6 months, with adverse events such as infusion-related reactions, infection, and hypogammaglobulinemia. And it's a newcomer to the space. So Seer is trying to bring this drug to market to be a competitor with MH1991. For the clinical trial results, from a publications perspective, the tone is going to be objective, data-oriented, and conservative. In this phase 3 randomized head-to-head trial of KR1994 versus MH1991 in patients with relapsing multiple sclerosis, both agents achieved statistically significant reductions in relapse rate and lesion burden from baseline, something that in publications, you'll see relatively frequently, they have to be unbiased. So if these two drugs are equivalent to each other, you have to say it in such a way. And there were no statistically significant differences observed between treatment arms across primary or secondary endpoints, including time to confirm disability progression. So then what you might say, because this is in fact Sierra Biopharma's work, KR 1994 demonstrated a favorable benefit risk profile with safety findings consistent with this mechanism of action. These results support the drug as a clinically effective option for multiple sclerosis comparable to MH 1991. Again, taking that unbiased approach. And that further analyses may help identify the patient subgroups that could derive the best value from this targeted therapy. From a medical affairs perspective, you're taking a tone that's balanced, clinically oriented, and educational. KR 1994 demonstrated robust clinical efficacy. You can already see a little bit of a shift in the language between medical affairs and publications, despite it having comparable outcomes to MH 1991 in relapse rates and disability progression in patients. Notably, and this is where things start to shift, KR 1994 offers a distinct therapeutic approach via targeted CD19 positive B cell depletion with a dosing schedule of just 2 infusions per year. So now we're starting to differentiate the two drugs from each other despite the fact that they're equivalent. And patient-reported outcomes improved across both arms, reinforcing the broad impact of disease control. While the efficacy of the two agents was similar, their differing safety and administration profiles offer opportunities for individualized treatment decisions. Sierra Therapeutics remains committed to supporting evidence-based discussions around the use of KR 1994 in diverse clinical contexts. So now you see how this shifts from publications. While we're still maintaining kind of like a neutral tone, we are now talking about how they're different from one another. Does a patient with multiple sclerosis want to take one pill a day, or do they want one injection every 6 months? And Sierra is going to, like the pharma company, can differentiate from the current standard of care by doing something like this, despite the fact that they have the same efficacy. From a commercial and marketing perspective, this is where it's persuasive, benefit-oriented, and compliant. KR 1994 delivered strong, clinically meaningful outcomes in a head-to-head trial against MH 1991. Again, not disparaging the fact that the other drug is efficacious, but ultimately working to kind of differentiate itself from the current standard of care. KR 1994 is set apart by its convenient twice-yearly dosing, offering patients long-lasting efficacy with fewer treatment days. Again, harping on that differentiation aspect. And then here, KR 1994 thus represents a powerful treatment option that supports both efficacy and flexibility. This novel treatment option empowers physicians and patients to take control of relapsing multiple sclerosis with fewer doctor's visits and strong clinical results. So now you can see that we've now fully differentiated and are moving away from talking about the standard of care into what this drug, what this drug offers over the current standard of care. To kind of give you a summary there of the language differences among the pillars, I already talked a little bit about the tones, publications being objective, data-oriented, and conservative, med affairs being balanced, clinically oriented, and educational, and then commercial and marketing being persuasive, benefit-oriented, and compliant. From a messaging perspective, publications prioritizes the statistical readout and provides a balanced interpretation of the data. And very importantly, what you probably notice is that it avoids the pre-approval promotion. Medical affairs highlights the relevance to patient care in support of nuanced decision-making. It provides messaging that can be discussed with HCPs. This is data that can go out into the field where a field team can work with a healthcare professional or a key opinion leader to understand what about this set of data is going to be important for the company to bring into commercial and marketing. And then for commercial marketing, it focuses really heavily on that product differentiation, the treatment advantages, and ultimately the value within the treatment landscape. So what does that drug offer over the standard of care, despite the fact that the efficacy was the same in this kind of in this imaginary trial? And then to give you an overall summary of my presentation, crafting a medical narrative involves multiple teams, including medical communications agencies that are tasked with creating narratives that drive therapies to the market. The functions of an agency, so a medical communications agency, supports the development of scientific content, ensures content accuracy, and ultimately the alignment with client objectives. For the three pillars of medical communications. You have publications, medical affairs, and commercial marketing teams that independently contribute to a unified medical narrative. So as you just saw, there's a variety of different language differences among these three different pillars that ultimately lead into the crafting of a narrative for a drug. And then the importance of the target audience. Understanding your target audience is essential to crafting a compelling narrative to support a novel therapy. With that, thank you very much for inviting me to come and chat today with you, and I'll take any questions that you have.
Thank you, Mike. I don't know, Katie, I have a question actually. Yeah. How do AI tools impact your job? How do you use those to really help yourself? I assume you could use these to kind of be more effective and to dive through some of the existing literature and craft your narrative. So what's the sort of benefit of them, and what's the risk, I guess?
Yeah, so that's actually a really good question, and it's one that doesn't have a direct answer yet. So our team has a new, or like our agency has a new team that's actually working on on AI related tools. My apologies. We have a new team that's working on AI related tools. So they are developing ways to do like literature synthesis for a disease state. So like ways that we can, get information for publications very quickly. And then one really key thing is that we never enter pharmaceutical company data into AI engines. So it's really important that we stay away from stuff like that because we don't know where it goes. And then, say like, Johnson & Johnson has a new drug that's out on the market, and Novartis is interested in how this drug is doing. If somebody from Johnson & Johnson had plugged their data into an AI search engine to generate a summary of, say, like a clinical study report, for instance, and Novartis can go in and find that, then you have like a significant issue when it comes to your strategy. So ultimately what we do is we can use AI to inform how we might say specific things, how like look for trends in the literature, but we never use it for like actual development of content.
Okay. Yeah, I could see that if you don't have a siloed system, that could be a real risk.
Right.
Katie, how are you guys doing in M219? Are there questions there?
Yes, actually, I have a question. Thank you for the presentation. It's very informative, actually. So my question is, which practices would you recommend to improve our writing skills if we want to pursue a career in this field?
Yeah, so I think that one thing is everybody has these skills now, right? So as a PhD with or in a postdoc, you've been working your entire career toward this specific goal. When it comes to like I said, the easy bridge over is through publications, right? Because that's what we know, that's what we've done. We've created Congress abstracts, we've created posters, we've created primary manuscripts. And so like all of that work that you've done already contributes directly to what you would do possibly in a medical communications agency. Like moving into medical affairs and moving into commercial and marketing is actually, it's a little bit more difficult when you're starting off as a medical writer to get into those specific spaces, but it's ultimately you can leverage what you already have into publications. There are ways that you can kind of like improve writing. It really just is spending more time with like just working on like specific writing projects and things like that. But overall, I wouldn't say that there are any tools that could necessarily improve over what you've already done.
Thanks. We have a question in the chat. Let me read it. Someone would like to know about the interview process and if you had to submit a writing sample.
Yeah, so the interview process typically starts with a phone call. So you would discuss with the hiring manager, and really what they're looking for is that you're a person, right? They want to know that you can communicate with someone over a phone, right? So being yourself and ultimately just having a conversation that you can carry with another person is a really big and important part of that. If the hiring manager likes you, they send you like they'll send you a prompt to write about. So you won't actually have to supply a writing sample up front. They'll ask you to write about a specific thing. So for our company, the way that that works is they give you a clinical trial publication and say, write a summary for healthcare professionals. And then you'll give like a small presentation on usually on a topic of your choice, of something that you're passionate about. And after that, that will be kind of the end of the process. And ultimately, if you do well, you'd get the job.
We have another question in the room.
Okay, I saw some positions for medical writer that are open right now, and
Hmm?
there is like a requirement of industry experience. Do you think it's always like this? We need to have this industry experience, or it's okay not have, just jump in the like one postdoc and start writing?
Yeah. Do you remember what the actual title of the role was?
I looked some, but I think it was medical writer.
Okay. So generally speaking, an entry level medical writer is not required to have industry experience. So, but I will say that they're like, if you're looking for a medical writer role and it happens to be in a pharmaceutical company, they tend to require industry experience. And the reason for that is because they usually want people that are versed in regulatory writing. So those are the roles that I usually see at the entry level that require some level of industry experience. And usually the way that people acquire that is through like a contract position. So they will go and work contract for like a third party clinical trial company like IQVIA would be a good example. Doing regulatory writing there and then transition into the pharma company that way. But in the agency space, usually an entry level medical writer will never require a level of industry experience. You'd be able to get it out of a postdoc.
Okay, we have another question. Can you talk about the salary for the entry level medical
Yeah.
writing job?
Yes. So it is. It's dependent on region. So where you live, since all of you live in a very expensive area, the salary is going to be a little bit higher. For a medical writer too, you'd be looking around like 85 to 90,000 to start. And then it scales up from there with the position that you go. Part of it is due to as you kind of go up through the ranks, it's scaled based on how the business is doing. So if the business has been performing poorly, but they still want to move you along, the raise might be a little bit lower. But as you kind of go through the space, it scales pretty well. But yeah, 85 to 90,000 is pretty standard for New York, Washington, kind of like those areas where it's a lot more expensive to live.
All right. Mike, I want to thank you for your presentation today and for your time. I'm going to stop the recording now.